with that, would love to welcome you all to our first Empower Hour program. We're very excited to have you all here and to be starting this program series. Our goal really is to start exploring different ways that we can empower EMPs with knowledge that will support your experience in the field. And so for our first Empower Hour session, we're going to be exploring the Association of Science and Technology Center's new professional pathways in informal STEM learning. So the pathways are a suite of tools that are designed to aid you and guide you in your professional development. Really quick before we get into the nitty-gritty, for those of you who haven't seen me before, I want to introduce myself. I am Dana. I am the secretary for the board of directors for NEMPN, and I will be one of your hosts tonight, along with one of our board members at large, Perry Raymond. And then last but certainly not least, I'm very excited to welcome Jenny Crane, who is the manager of programs for the ASTC. She worked on the development of these, the professional pathways directly, and so we're very grateful to have her here this evening to give us some background and some guidance on these tools. Okay, so just to give you a quick overview, we are, after this brief welcome, going to turn it over to Jenny, who's going to tell you a bit more about the background of the project and how the tools were developed. And then after that, Perry and I will kind of walk you through the tools a bit and talk about how we think they can be helpful for EMPs. And then we'll have some time for audience Q&A at the end. Before we completely jump in, we were hoping to get some responses in the chat about what kind of organization you work in. If you're currently working in the GLAM field, if you're not, that's okay too. You could respond with what kind of institutions you're interested in working in, what kind of roles you're interested in, and we'll kind of go from there. I will say, I personally am unfortunately not working in the field yet. I consider myself an EMP, but for example, I'm interested in working in education and history organizations and cultural organizations specifically. That's my area of interest. Let's see, educator at a state historic site in North Carolina, job searching, I feel you. Hoping to work in education and a science museum, registrar for a nonprofit botanical garden and research library, and public programs coordinator for Natural History Museum. Cool. Okay. So one of the reasons that we wanted to start with this specifically is because we really feel that these tools can be beneficial for a wide variety of professionals in this field. It was developed specifically with informal STEM learning in mind, but we really do think it can be even more broadly applied than that. And so we wanted to get a sense of the variety of different roles and professional backgrounds we have here, because that's something that we'll touch on throughout the presentation. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny to tell us a bit about the background of the project.
Since these are the professional pathways in informal STEM learning, we should probably start out by defining what we mean by informal STEM learning. So ISL for short is the broad range of ways that people learn about science, technology, engineering, and math from experiences and interactions in everyday life or in designed settings. So these designed settings can encompass a wide range of institutions, including science centers, zoos, aquariums, children's museums, natural history museums, and more. It also includes workers across a wide variety of different roles. The project was informed by, again, workers across a variety of organizations and roles, and also with a variety of backgrounds, some of whom may have formal museum training, many of whom may not. So a big intention behind this process was to start to define what standards are really needed to work in this type of setting, so that everyone could get up to speed and be on the same page, regardless of what your background or pathway into informal STEM learning might be. So, now to just give you a little bit of background about the project, the professional pathways in informal STEM learning, or pathways for short, were developed in collaboration between the Association of Science and Technology Centers, COSI's Center for Research and Evaluation, and Oregon State University's STEM Research Center. And it was originally intended to be created to support professional learning for anyone who works in ISL, whether you're 6 months into your ISL career or 35 years on and going strong. Also, to support you whether you are working in visitor services, curation, or something else. So, the Pathways is a suite of tools, a framework, self assessment, and learning plan that was developed with the input and review from hundreds of professionals from across the field and at all different points in their career. And as we look at it more in depth in the following slides, you'll realize that these tools can help you to identify, reflect, and build on the skills and knowledge that you need for your work in the ISL field. We won't go through the specifics of this timeline too in detail, but the most important thing to glean from this slide here is that a lot of time and effort went into developing this framework. It was not a quick process, it was very deeply thought out, and many different people were consulted to try and make this the most comprehensive and helpful set of tools it possibly could be, over a number of years working on the project. With that, we are going to start looking a little closer at the tools themselves.
As Jenny was saying, these tools were designed with a lot of input from a lot of people holding many different roles in many different types of institutions. And so while these different individual jobs and organizations are unique, the tools are really designed to identify the common areas of skills and knowledge that are needed, and then organize them in a way that's easily able to be understood by people working in museums and those types of organizations. Each of the tools can be used pretty flexibly in a variety of different settings and contexts, but they're all really designed to help you understand, plan, and advance your skills, sort of going back to that motivation that Jenny was describing earlier. One important thing to note before we get into this is that these tools are intended to guide your professional growth. They're not necessarily meant to be performance evaluation tools. So if you don't necessarily, put yourself at expert level at every single one of the skill sets we're about to describe, that's okay. But it's just about helping you understand what areas you might want to grow in, depending on what your interests are. So there are technically 4 different tools within the Pathways suite of tools. The framework identifies the skills and knowledge that were identified by ISL professionals as being important for their daily work. And then the self-assessment is kind of based on that framework, and it allows you to reflect on different competencies that you would use in your work or that you'd like to develop that follow that framework. From there, the learning plan is a template that guides you to identify your professional development goals and a path for how to reach them. And then the strategies and resources are a library that ASTC has begun putting together, which includes resources on how professionals can develop the different competencies and some resources that may be helpful. So we are mostly today going to focus on the framework and the self-assessment. And we would encourage you to think about how these tools might be broadly applicable across the CLAM field, even though they are more geared towards STEM. And Perry, if you want to take it away with the framework.
Okay, thanks so much, Dana. So this first tool within the suite that we'll be looking at is going to be the framework, and it's 4 domains. And so the framework sort of sets the stage for Pathways as a suite of tools. So for our purposes, it's just a good place to begin. The framework's organized around the 4 domains, which is actually the inspo for ASTC's logo. But within the framework, as you can see on the screen, we have the first one, which is general expertise. And this is how professionals work with others to solve problems and accomplish goals. Then it's job-specific expertise, which is how professionals engage with ISL practices. And we'll get into how this domain can be more broadly applicable later. The third one is operations, which is how professionals engage with organizational structures and systems. And then audiences and impacts, which is how professionals navigate relationships between their organization and their communities. So we're going to go into each of these 4 domains, and as we do so, we just want you guys to keep in mind that these are going to be guiding the self-assessment later, so just kind of start thinking about these areas as we go through them. So as you can see from the preview of this framework document, each domain includes 4 categories within them. And so each category contains between 3 to 5 different competencies that describe the skills and knowledge that a professional needs to do their job successfully. So now we're going to go through each of the 4 domains briefly and give you guys an overview of the categories in that domain and then an example of a competency for each category. And this should start to give you an idea of the way that competencies are framed for the purposes of reflecting on your own skills and then when you take the self-assessment later on.
Yes, so as Perry said, the first domain is general expertise. Ask the question, how do I work with others to solve problems and accomplish our goals? The 4 categories within this domain are interpersonal skills and knowledge, reflective self-awareness, communication, and problem solving. And an example of what one of the competencies looks like for problem solving specifically is being able to use a variety of techniques and strategies for solving problems.
And then the next domain is job-specific expertise, which asks the question, how do I understand and engage with the practices and activities of the ISL field? And these categories of competencies are professional learning and knowledge, engagement in the profession, strategic practices, and technology-based skills. So there's a couple examples of some of these competencies, and one of them could be engaging with professional organizations, networks, publications, other resources, or maybe it's just representing or promoting the work of ISL organizations and the field as a whole.
Can I interrupt and ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So would something like NEMPN quote unquote, like kind of count when we're thinking about professional or organization engagement?
Yeah, definitely. And then I also think the last category that we're going to go over, I would say is like the more relevant one to NEMPN, because it sort of looks at like mission and community and like who we serve as an organization. But yeah, I think this one could be applicable too.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate with this section, while it is very geared towards STEM specifically, I think you could really kind of self-insert whatever your organization's discipline is. You know, you want to represent, for their purposes, represent and promote the work of informal STEM learning. I think you could say the same about informal history learning if you're working in like a living history organization, or of like reading education if you work in the libraries. I think there are ways to tweak this to whatever your specific discipline is, again, if that's to make it more applicable to you. But the core of the principle behind the competencies still applies pretty broadly across different types of organizations.
Awesome, thank you.
So the third domain is operations, asks the question, how do I engage with my organization's systems and structures? And the 4 categories within this are organizational structures, leadership and management, policies, standards and practices, and resources. And so a competency example from the leadership and management category is being able to understand the skills and responsibilities of management and leadership. And so I think it's worth noting that even that competency is not very like specific to STEM. You could get that experience from a variety of different backgrounds or areas. It kind of goes back to what Jenny was saying earlier about everyone having a different path into this field. So this is an example of like, I feel like personally I've gained a lot of skill and responsibilities of management and leadership through NEMPN and my work as a board member, even though I don't necessarily have that formal experience directly in a museum setting. So there's a lot of different ways to interpret your own skills to see how they apply in these different areas.
Okay, and then the fourth and final piece of the framework is audiences and impact, which asks the question, how do I navigate the relationship between my organization's values and the multifaceted communities we serve? And so these categories are purpose and role, individuals, groups, and communities, diversity and equity, and research and evaluation. And then I think a competency example from individuals, groups, and communities could be understanding and responding to different interests and priorities of different audiences. And this is the one that, like I mentioned, I think is especially relevant for NEMPN. And then, yeah, going forward, I think this is also the question that we anticipate could start to guide a lot of our 2026 programming and kind of what we want to see from the self-assessment.
Yes. Okay, so we actually want to give everyone a little bit of time to look through the framework. So I just sent a link in chat to the online version, and we've got a little timer here. We're going to do about 5 minutes to just look over the framework. And as you do, keep an eye out for like what areas of the framework resonate with you most, where you might want to grow your skills. If there's anything you think is particularly important for your role, just so we can kind of start looking through and engaging with that a little. Alrighty, so with that, we've had a couple minutes to look it over. Does anyone want to share in chat if there were any areas of the framework that really resonated with you, or just any thoughts you had as you kind of took a couple minutes to look through it?
I can sort of kick it off. When I first looked at this, I thought that what was especially useful for me was because I just started my first like real museum job earlier this year. I was just really able to identify with like one competency or one category within actually all 4 of the domains. So like organizational structures, just getting involved with the community around my museum and meeting all these new people. And I was just sort of in a non-traditional spot where my museum is actually just run by a board and I'm only one of 2 staff members. And so it's still, you know, just kind of a learning curve. And I feel like a lot of this could help navigate some of those, I wouldn't call them problems, but just things I'm unfamiliar with. So, yeah.
I definitely can say I feel similarly. Like I have done a museum studies educational program, so I have some background in a lot of these things, but I was able to see areas where, you know, I didn't necessarily have as much formal training in the management side of things, but I like to think I might be in a leadership role one day. And so getting some of those insights on like the organizational structure, the leadership and management, like what it looks like to be competent in those areas, I think is definitely helpful as I think about the kinds of roles I might want to grow into someday. Any other thoughts anyone would like to share before we step away from the framework? Except not really.
I've been thinking a lot recently about like the audience and impact portion, because as like a registrar, I feel really objects focused and not necessarily having that like outward component. But after looking over the framework, like we've been thinking a lot about how we're describing artists and their backgrounds in our database. And I think that like diversity and inclusion aspect I can see in like our assessment of our database and what we're hoping to do. So it's nice to see this applicable. Like, wasn't thinking that one would apply to what I'm working on so much. So that was nice to see in the framework.
I've also been dealing with some technology, and for example, so we have a STEAM lab and we have 3D printers. And so I've had to teach myself a lot about the 3D printers and a lot of problem solving because they tend to have issues about every day.
Yeah, I think also something that's cool about this is I just feel like there's a really nice blend between like soft and hard skills, like things that are tangible and then intangible, like collaboration versus building a website, which is also just nice to reflect on like how I can show off in the future and what I know like I'm good at or what I like, which yeah, I feel like is really valuable.
Yeah, I was gonna say, to me, this feels really good at having me do a little bit more like introspective reflection than maybe I'm normally tended towards. And thinking about like, oh wow, like what are all the things I'm actually bringing to the table in terms of like ways I've thought about impact? Because I think the way it frames this is really nice around like what are the outputs and the impact you're seeing from that, as opposed to maybe just like that thing you're doing.
Yeah, definitely. I also think it's interesting. This is like it's built to be an individual personal assessment, but a lot of because it reflects best practice in the field, it also can be a way to get you thinking more about like what is and is not showing up at your institution. So I know I saw Susie in the chat was talking about audiences and impacts as being something that really relates to her job, and that like figuring out how to reach the current audience is like a big part of what her organization is trying to do. And I know someone else mentioned that as well earlier. It's kind of interesting to see where those overlaps are, to where like it's professional development for you, but it also is like just good reminders of what are the best practices in this field and what is important. I think many of us, especially if you've worked in small museums, have had that experience of like somebody really wanted to have a collection, but nobody really knew how a museum should run and like what those standards ought to be. And so I think this is a really great like free resource, even just to look at kind of what are the best practices across the field, even from an organizational perspective.
Yeah, I was gonna, maybe this is a dumb question, but like, are there ways we can think about how we would use something like this, to your comment, to like kind of frame strategic planning seems to like kind of broad and heady, but like kind of organizational self-reflection, like beyond me as an individual. But are there things we're thinking about for resources attached to this to be like, hey, like what maybe should we be anchoring on for like skills and best practices to move us forward and let us grow, versus being like, to your comment, oh, like someone thought this was a cool idea or had like stuff that they wanted to save.
Yeah, and that's so true. And I want to highlight what Jenny just sent in the chat, because I think it's a really great point when you're thinking about using this framework from an organizational perspective. You as an individual don't necessarily have to have every single one of these skills, but you can use the framework to identify what skills you need in a team, so that you like have people who are strong in a bunch of different categories, so that cohesively you are able to achieve that goal of having a successfully run institution. So it can be used to evaluate a team as much as it can be used to evaluate an individual.
The second tool in the Pathway Suite is the self-assessment, which we're going to be looking at briefly now, so you sort of have a sense of what it looks like. And the tool's goal is to help ISL professionals better understand their skills and knowledge, which I feel like is a great segue after the little convo we just had. But this is really useful for figuring out like where you are in career development, and what your competencies might be, and then how you want to develop or fine tune them in the future. And then Dana, yeah. So the self-assessment's broken down into sections based on the 4 domains, and then further broken down by 4 categories within each domain. So for example, one of these pages on the screen is one category within the general expertise domain. So for each category, the competencies are listed along with space to assess your skill level and knowledge on a scale from emerging to expert. And then examples of what a particular competency might look like in action are then included to help you assess, along with some clear definitions for each of the 5 skill ratings that you have to choose from. And then finally, at the end of each section, there's then a place to reflect and note priorities for that domain. So now we'll have you guys take another 3 to 5 minutes to work through a few of the competencies in one of the domains. And then whenever you guys are ready, or if you feel comfortable sharing, you can write how it felt to rate your competency. And then we'll also give you the chance to share any questions that you may have.
And I can kind of kick things off with this one since Perry did with the last one. So I've taken the full self-assessment myself. I know I personally found that I was struggling with determining whether or not I was rating myself fairly. Like I couldn't tell sometimes if I was tooting my own horn too much or if I was like falling prey to imposter syndrome. And I think one thing that helped with that was having the examples of what those competencies might look like, because I was able to see some examples and think, oh, I might not have like thought of that as an example of demonstrating that skill, but I have done that. So I guess like I can feel more assertive in the rating that I gave myself on that. I don't know if anyone else felt similarly while they were looking through some of these, but
yeah, I felt the same way. I feel like normally when it comes to a sliding scale like this, I'm always a glass half empty person. Like I'm always going to be like not likely or emerging in this case. But actually, I sort of thought it was a confidence boost for me this time. A lot of them I definitely felt comfortable rating a little bit higher on the scale. So that was just like a fun moment to see that I do feel like I've grown a little bit. And it was also just like a good checkpoint to, just kind of like reevaluate after like a lot of the new professional development I've done recently. So that was my main takeaway from it.
I'm curious also, did most of you just start at the top, or did anybody like skip ahead to a random domain that they were interested in to look through?
I can share a little bit about my experience looking through it. I'm definitely excited to have more time to look through it carefully. And I think, as I said, I'm still in job search mode. So I feel like the first 2 parts of the framework are going to be much more relevant just to be reflecting on my own skills. Where are my strengths? Where are my weaknesses? And I think being able to articulate that in written applications and interviews is going to be really helpful. And then I hope at some point soon I'll have a job in the field to be able to like reflect more carefully on also the later part, the second half of the frameworks too.
Yeah, that makes total sense. As someone also job searching in the field, I definitely, I felt like this was helpful to like shape some of my aspirations too, and see where the areas are that I want to grow to hopefully make myself a more competitive candidate. see, Heidi said that the assessment reminded them of DISC assessment. I'll admit I'm not familiar with that assessment personally. Okay. Oh, personality assessment for the workplace. Yeah. Yeah, there definitely, I think as I went through the self-assessment, I noticed even more places where some of my past jobs that weren't even necessarily in GLAM were still applicable. And so that I think was helpful too, to think more about transferable skills. And then I see Susie said in chat, that she felt like she kind of changed her thought about which domain resonated the most, and connected more with general expertise, and found a couple areas to improve on that weren't as obvious before. And I think for me, when I went through the self-assessment, it definitely gave me like, I thought I got the framework before, and I did understand it in a broad sense, but definitely going through the self-assessment and just seeing all of those like really detailed examples, I think gave me such a good, even more in-depth understanding of the framework, which I personally found helpful. Yeah, this might look like examples. And I also found myself frequently returning to the definitions of what the rating scale means. That was on that very first page, how they define from emerging to expert. Because, those words can be emerging, developing, expert, like all of these words can be kind of up for interpretation. So I know especially with sliding scales, I'm a person who needs clear definitions. And I felt like that was helpful to remind myself, and especially when I was struggling with the imposter syndrome, being able to like see those clear, quantifiable definitions of what those different ratings look like, I found very helpful too, like very clear in the definitions across the board, I feel like, in the examples as well. Unless anyone else has any burning comments, I think we'll go ahead and move into the wrap up, just since it's getting a little bit late. So I just want to revisit quickly the overview of the tools, to reiterate that while we really focused on the self-assessment and the framework today, the next steps once you complete the assessment theoretically would be developing a learning plan. And so ASTC has also created a template for the learning plan to help you identify where you are now, where you want to go, and how you'll get there. And then they've also pulled together a library of strategies and resources that can help you develop your knowledge and skills in those areas that you identify. But before we close tonight, we just want to look at how this connects back to the work that we're doing as an organization in any MPN. So we really feel that this framework can be a fantastic tool to help us help you, our members, because we want to do the best we can to understand what our audience and our members need. We'll call back to earlier in the framework. But we are hoping that by understanding what your needs are better, we can better provide relevant strategies, relevant resources, and things that can really support you in your own development as emerging museum professionals. So we would like to invite you all to take some time to complete the assessment, and if you're comfortable, share your results anonymously with any MPN. So we'll be sending out a form with these slides after the program. And specifically, we'd be really curious to know what areas you're most looking to improve in, so that we can maybe try and plan our 2026 professional development programming around y'all's needs and interests, so that we really can be doing our best to support our community in the ways that it needs. And with that, if anyone has any more general thoughts or questions, especially while we have a couple minutes with Jenny here as the expert, now would be the time.
I actually have a question about NEMPN.
Yeah.
Just because I'm kind of new to the network, can you just give like a quick summary on other kinds of programs and maybe like networking events, kinds of things that are happening?
Yeah, of course. So we're kind of at a place with programming where we are turning over a bit of a new leaf and trying to rethink how we do programming, rethink our formats mostly, but we try to focus our programming around a mix of community programming, things that are more casual, more informal, for people in our network to just connect. So for example, in the past, we've had book clubs. We recently did a museum themed trivia night. We've discussed doing like an EMP movie night, those sorts of things. We try to then balance those with more professional development oriented programming. That is more of like the relevant job skills and training side of things, like what we're doing tonight. And then the other piece of it is that we try to do some programming around advocacy. So every year, typically it's been in the spring, we host Museum Workers Advocacy Day, which is typically about a 2-day virtual conference that we have started. It's initially a response to AAM's Museum Advocacy Day. But we were then saying, we also need to be advocating for the museum workers to have things like salary transparency and fair compensation and benefits, and entry-level positions that don't require 20 years of experience. I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean. So we do host that every year as well. We will be doing it again in 2026. And so that's kind of like the 3 areas of programming and networking opportunities that we currently offer. Although we are open to suggestions as a board. Again, I think really our focus is we want to help you the way that you need it. So if people have ideas for ways that we can better support it and are interested in helping us, make it happen, because we are an all volunteer board. Quick plug, if you're interested in joining our committee, those are the volunteers that help us make all these things happen. But yes, that's kind of the major areas. I don't know, Michelle, Perry, Melissa, did I miss anything?
No, that was a great summary. The only thing I would add is that if you aren't already on the Discord, that's starting to be just a great place to streamline and then foster communication, like the EMP advice channel. So if support within the field and connecting and networking with other EMPs is really what you're here for, then I would say the Discord is a great place to start. I myself definitely want to start utilizing that EMP advice channel more. So yeah, I think thanks for the link. With the start of the Discord and all these channels, that hopefully we'll have a little bit more of that too, in addition to the programming.
Yeah, the hope with the Discord has really been to create more opportunities for asynchronous but more regular engagement, because we understand it's hard to be getting on a Google Meet call at 8 p.m. On a Thursday night, on a weeknight. We all have things to do in the morning. So yeah, I would say definitely the Discord is a great opportunity to have more of that connection, centered a little more around your own free time. It is 9 o'clock, so if anybody has to leave, fair enough, no pressure. But if anybody has any other questions, I know I can stay on for probably another 5 to 10 minutes, if need be. But yeah, thank you guys for coming, and thank you again, Jenny, for coming in and supporting us and making this the best it could be, because your insights were really just incredible.